Marcus sat in his advanced history class, his mind racing with ideas as the discussion on civil rights unfolded. When called upon, he stood up, his voice clear and confident. The civil rights movement wasn't just about legal equality. It was about challenging deeply ingrained societal norms and power structures. As he delved into the complexities of systemic racism and its lasting impacts, he could see his classmates nodding in agreement. Suddenly, Mr. Caldwell's sharp voice cut through the air. "That's quite enough, Marcus. We don't need another lecture on how oppressed you feel." The room fell silent as Caldwell continued. "Perhaps if you spent less time complaining and more time studying, you might actually earn your place here." The silence was broken by nervous laughter from some students. Marcus felt his face burn with humiliation as he slowly sat down, his eyes fixed on his desk. The rest of the class passed in a blur, with Marcus barely registering the continued discussion. As the bell rang, Marcus grabbed his backpack and rushed out of the room, avoiding eye contact with his classmates. In the hallway, he could hear whispers and muffled conversations, knowing they were talking about what had just happened. He hurried to the bathroom, locking himself in a stall as he tried to regain his composure. Later that evening, Marcus sat at the dinner table with his father, Jamal. The weight of the day's events hung heavy on his shoulders. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "something happened at school today." As he recounted the incident with Mr. Caldwell, his voice trembled slightly. "It's not just today. It's every day. I feel invisible, like my voice doesn't matter. Like I don't belong there, no matter how hard I work or how well I do." Jamal listened intently, his brow furrowed with concern. As Marcus finished speaking, Jamal reached across the table and grasped his son's hand. "I hear you, son," he said firmly, "and I promise you we're going to do something about this. You belong there as much as anyone else, and it's time they understood that." The next morning, a sleek black Bentley pulled up to the school's entrance, turning heads as Jamal stepped out. His tailored suit and commanding presence drew the attention of students and faculty alike. As he strode through the hallways, whispers followed in his wake. Jamal was escorted to the principal's office, where Principal Anderson and Mr. Caldwell were waiting. The atmosphere was tense as they all took their seats. Jamal didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here to discuss the discriminatory treatment my son has been experiencing, particularly from Mr. Caldwell," he stated, his voice calm but firm. He recounted Marcus's experiences, emphasizing the need for an inclusive environment. "This school prides itself on excellence, but true excellence cannot exist without diversity and respect," Jamal asserted. He outlined specific instances of bias, including the recent classroom humiliation. Principal Anderson listened attentively, her expression a mix of concern and contemplation. She nodded at several points, jotting down notes. Mr. Caldwell, however, sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of defensive irritation. "Mr. Washington," Caldwell interjected, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. I treat all students equally, and I won't lower my standards for anyone." His tone was dismissive, bordering on condescending. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly. "Equal treatment isn't about lowering standards, Mr. Caldwell. It's about recognizing and nurturing potential in all students, regardless of their background." Principal Anderson, sensing the growing tension, intervened. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, Mr. Washington. We take these matters seriously and will certainly look into it." Her words were cautious, diplomatic. As the meeting concluded, Jamal stood, his posture unyielding. "I expect to see concrete changes," he said. "My son, and every student here, deserves an environment where they can thrive without fear of discrimination." After school, Marcus met Sophia at their usual spot in the local coffee shop. The bustling atmosphere provided a stark contrast to the tension they felt inside. "I can't believe your dad actually went to the school," Sophia said, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and concern. Marcus nodded, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Yeah, but I'm worried it might make things worse." Caldwell looked like he was ready to explode. He paused, then added, "But you know what? I'm tired of feeling powerless. We need to do something ourselves." Sophia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if we started a group? Not just for us, but for everyone who feels like they don't have a voice?" The idea sparked a light in Marcus's eyes. They spent the next hour brainstorming, their excitement growing with each suggestion. "We could call it Diverse Voices," Marcus proposed. "A place where everyone can share their experiences and learn from each other." The next day, they approached their friends cautiously, gauging interest. To their surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Students from various backgrounds, some who had never spoken up before, expressed interest in joining. Their first meeting was held in an empty classroom after school. The group was small but diverse. African American, Hispanic, Asian, and white students all gathered together. As they went around the room introducing themselves and sharing their reasons for joining, a sense of camaraderie began to form. One student, Lee, spoke about feeling pressured to conform to the model minority stereotype. Another, Jessica, shared her experiences as a scholarship student feeling out of place among wealthier peers. Each story resonated, creating a web of understanding and empathy. As the meeting progressed, the initial awkwardness melted away. Ideas flowed freely. Suggestions for cultural awareness events, discussions on systemic inequalities, and ways to promote diversity in the curriculum. By the end, there was a palpable sense of excitement and purpose in the room. Marcus and Sophia exchanged a look of satisfaction as they wrapped up the meeting. They had created something meaningful, a safe space where silenced voices could finally be heard. As the group dispersed, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Change, he realized, could start with them. Mr. Caldwell sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of ungraded papers before him. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on his mind. He could feel the shifting atmosphere in the school, the questioning glances from students and colleagues alike. At home that evening, his wife, Sarah, noticed his distracted demeanor. "What's wrong, John?" she asked, setting down her book. Caldwell sighed, recounting the meeting with Jamal Washington and the growing pressure he felt from the administration. "I don't understand why everyone's making such a fuss," he grumbled. "I've been teaching the same way for years. It's worked just fine." Sarah's expression hardened. "Has it really, John? Or have you just been ignoring the students who don't fit your mold?" Her words struck a nerve, and Caldwell found himself on the defensive. "I treat everyone the same," he insisted, but even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. "Do you?" Sarah pressed. "Think about it, John. When was the last time you really listened to a student like Marcus? Have you ever considered that your sameness might not be as equal as you think?" Caldwell fell silent, his wife's words forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. He thought back to his own upbringing in a predominantly white, affluent neighborhood, his education at elite institutions. Had those experiences shaped his perceptions more than he realized? As the night wore on, Caldwell found himself lost in reflection. He recalled instances where he might have dismissed or underestimated students of color, times when he'd made assumptions based on stereotypes rather than individual merit. The next morning, Caldwell entered his classroom with a sense of unease. As he faced the students, he found himself noticing things he'd overlooked before, the way some students tensed when he called on them, the careful neutrality in their responses. He made a halting attempt to engage more diverse perspectives during the lesson, but old habits died hard. His discomfort was palpable, and the students sensed it. By the end of the class, Caldwell felt drained and conflicted. Change, he realized, wouldn't come easily. But for the first time in years, he began to question whether his approach truly served all his students. The path forward was unclear, but the first seeds of doubt had been planted. Principal Anderson sat in her office, her brow furrowed as she reviewed the notes from her meeting with Jamal Washington. The gravity of the situation was becoming increasingly clear. She picked up her phone and dialed Jamal's number. "Mr. Washington," she began, "I've been thinking about our discussion. I believe it's time for some significant changes in our curriculum and policies." Jamal listened intently as she outlined her ideas for a more inclusive educational environment. Later that week, Principal Anderson called a faculty meeting. The teachers filed in, murmuring amongst themselves, sensing the importance of the gathering. As they settled, she stood at the front of the room, her posture resolute. "Colleagues," she began, "we've prided ourselves on academic excellence for years. But recent events have shown us that we're falling short in other crucial areas. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. We need to address the lack of diversity and inclusion in our school culture and curriculum. The room buzzed with a mix of reactions. Some teachers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Caldwell sat rigidly, his face a mask of forced neutrality. Principal Anderson continued, outlining plans for diversity training, curriculum reviews, and the formation of student-led initiatives. We've invited 2 students, Marcus Washington and Sophia Rodriguez, to present their ideas to us next week, she announced. As the meeting concluded, the faculty broke into small groups, discussing the proposed changes. Some expressed enthusiasm, while others voiced concerns about implementation and pushback from conservative parents. Meanwhile, Marcus and Sophia sat in the school library, preparing for their presentation. I can't believe we're actually going to address the entire faculty, Sophia said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. This is our chance to make a real difference, he replied. They spent hours refining their points, ensuring their message was clear and impactful. As the day of the presentation approached, word spread through the student body. The halls buzzed with anticipation, and Marcus and Sophia found themselves at the center of attention. They knew that their words could potentially shape the future of their school community, and they were determined to make them count. The faculty lounge was packed as Marcus and Sophia took their places at the front of the room. Principal Anderson introduced them, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and anticipation. As Marcus began to speak, the room fell silent. We're here today because our school, despite its prestige, has failed many of its students, Marcus started, his voice clear and steady. We've felt invisible, undervalued, and sometimes even targeted because of our race or background. Sophia continued, detailing specific instances of bias they and their peers had experienced. She spoke about the subtle ways discrimination manifested in classroom dynamics, curriculum choices, and social interactions. The teachers listened, some with growing discomfort, others with dawning realization. As they progressed through their presentation, Marcus and Sophia proposed concrete changes, diversifying the literature curriculum, implementing bias training for faculty, creating mentorship programs for minority students, and establishing a student-led diversity council. The reaction from the audience was mixed. Some teachers nodded enthusiastically, clearly moved by the students' words. Others sat with arms crossed, their expressions skeptical or defensive. Mr. Caldwell, in particular, seemed to grow more agitated as the presentation went on. When the floor opened for questions, the discussion became heated. One teacher praised the students' initiative, while another expressed concern about lowering academic standards. Marcus and Sophia held their ground, responding to each point with poise and clarity. As the meeting concluded, Principal Anderson stepped forward. "Thank you, Marcus and Sophia, for your courage and insights," she said. "I propose we form a diversity committee to implement these ideas, with student representatives included." The announcement was met with a mix of applause and murmurs. As people filed out of the room, the atmosphere was charged with conflicting emotions. Some teachers approached Marcus and Sophia to offer support, while others huddled in corners, whispering their reservations. Marcus and Sophia left the meeting feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. They had opened a dialogue, but it was clear that the path to change would be challenging. As they walked down the hallway, they overheard snippets of conversation, some supportive, others resistant. The school was buzzing with debate, and they knew this was just the beginning of a long journey towards true inclusivity. In the weeks following the presentation, subtle changes began to ripple through the school. Mr. Caldwell, despite his initial resistance, found himself reluctantly re-evaluating his teaching methods. One morning, he paused before starting his lesson, looking around the classroom with new awareness. Today, he began hesitantly. "I'd like to hear your perspectives on how this historical event might have affected different communities." The class fell silent, students exchanging surprised glances. Slowly, hands began to rise, and a tentative discussion unfolded. Meanwhile, Marcus and Sophia were busy organizing their first major event, a cultural awareness fair. They set up in the school gymnasium, coordinating booths that showcased various cultures represented in the student body. The air buzzed with excitement as students explored different stations, trying new foods and learning about diverse traditions. Principal Anderson walked through the fair, nodding approvingly. She stopped at Marcus and Sophia's booth. "This is impressive," she said warmly. "You've really brought the school together." As the day progressed, more and more students and faculty members filtered in. Even some skeptical teachers found themselves engaged, asking questions and participating in cultural activities. The event was clearly a success, generating positive energy throughout the school. However, not everyone was pleased with the changes. Mr. Caldwell watched from the sidelines, his expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. He overheard students praising Marcus and Sophia's leadership and felt a twinge of resentment. His position of authority seemed to be slipping away. Later that week, during a faculty meeting, Caldwell voiced his concerns. "While I appreciate the effort," he said stiffly, "I worry we're losing focus on academic rigor. These extracurricular activities are taking up valuable time." Principal Anderson responded firmly, "Mr. Caldwell, creating an inclusive environment is not at odds with academic excellence. In fact, it enhances it." Several other teachers nodded in agreement, leaving Caldwell feeling increasingly isolated. As the meeting adjourned, Caldwell lingered, watching his colleagues chat animatedly about upcoming diversity initiatives. He felt a growing sense of unease, realizing that the school he thought he knew was changing rapidly around him. The ground beneath his feet felt less stable than ever before, and he wasn't sure how to regain his footing in this new landscape. The school auditorium was filled to capacity for the Parent-Teacher Association meeting. The agenda: discussing the proposed changes to the school's curriculum and policies. As Principal Anderson outlined the initiatives, a palpable tension filled the air. One parent, Mr. Thompson, a wealthy businessman, stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "We send our children here for academic excellence, not social experiments. You're diluting the quality of education with all this diversity nonsense." Murmurs of agreement rippled through one section of the audience, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Principal Anderson tried to regain control, but more parents began voicing their concerns. "Our children are here to learn, not to be political activists," another parent chimed in. "This school has a long-standing tradition of excellence. Why change what works?" Jamal, who had been listening quietly, stood up. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent. "With all due respect," he began, his voice calm but firm, "what you call excellence has come at the cost of marginalizing and silencing many students. True excellence is inclusive." He went on to explain how diversity in education benefits all students, preparing them for a global workforce and fostering critical thinking skills. "We're not diluting education," Jamal asserted. "We're enriching it." As Jamal spoke, many parents nodded in agreement. Others, however, remained unconvinced. The meeting devolved into heated debates, with parents arguing back and forth about the merits and drawbacks of the proposed changes. In the midst of the chaos, Mr. Caldwell saw an opportunity. He stood up, clearing his throat loudly. As a long-standing member of this faculty, he began, "I have to agree with some of the concerns raised here. These changes are being implemented too hastily, without proper consideration of their impact." His words seemed to embolden the opposition. The meeting grew more heated, with parents and teachers alike taking sides. Principal Anderson struggled to maintain order, her attempts at mediation drowned out by the increasing volume of arguments. As the meeting finally adjourned, it was clear that the school community was deeply divided. Marcus and Sophia, who had been watching from the back of the room, exchanged worried glances. They had known change wouldn't be easy, but the level of resistance they were facing was daunting. The battle for inclusivity, it seemed, was far from over. Marcus sat in the school library, poring over documents he had requested through the student council. As he scanned the pages, his eyes widened in disbelief. He quickly texted Sophia, "Emergency meeting. Now." When Sophia arrived, Marcus showed her what he had discovered. Mr. Caldwell had been manipulating student performance data, subtly skewing grades and test scores to favor certain demographics. He's been doing this for years, Marcus said, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. No wonder the traditional approach seemed to work so well. Sophia looked shocked. "We need to tell your dad," she said firmly. Marcus nodded, knowing this information could change everything. That evening, Marcus presented his findings to Jamal. His father listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "This is serious, son," Jamal said finally. "We need to handle this carefully." The next day, Jamal requested an urgent meeting with Principal Anderson and the school board. As they gathered in the conference room, tension filled the air. Jamal laid out the evidence Marcus had uncovered, his voice steady but filled with controlled anger. Principal Anderson looked visibly shaken. "If this is true, it's a grave violation of our ethics and policies," she said. Board members exchanged worried glances, the implications of the revelation sinking in. As the meeting progressed, the door suddenly opened. Mr. Caldwell walked in, his face pale. "I heard there was an emergency meeting," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Jamal turned to face him. "Mr. Caldwell, we've uncovered some disturbing information about grade manipulation. Would you care to explain?" Caldwell's facade crumbled. He looked around the room, seeing the accusing faces of his colleagues. I was trying to maintain the school's reputation," he stammered. "Our rankings, our prestige. I thought I was doing what was best for the school." Principal Anderson stood up, her voice firm. "What's best for the school is honesty and equal opportunity for all students, Mr. Caldwell. Your actions have undermined everything we stand for." As the gravity of the situation became clear, the board members began discussing immediate actions. Caldwell, realizing the depth of his misconduct, slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. The meeting concluded with a decision to launch a full investigation and to place Mr. Caldwell on immediate administrative leave. As they filed out of the room, Jamal placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You did the right thing, son," he said quietly. "This is how real change begins." The following week, the school buzzed with tension as news of Mr. Caldwell's actions spread. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Caldwell called for a school-wide assembly, claiming he had been misunderstood. As students and faculty filled the auditorium, Caldwell took the stage, his demeanor a mix of defiance and desperation. "I've been portrayed as the villain," he began, his voice strained. "But everything I did was to maintain this school's standards of excellence." He then turned his attention to Marcus and Sophia, who sat rigid in the front row. "These students, with their misguided crusade for diversity, are the real threat to our school's reputation," Caldwell declared, his voice rising. "They're undermining years of tradition and success." The auditorium erupted in murmurs and gasps. Marcus stood up, his voice clear and steady. "Mr. Caldwell, excellence built on discrimination and data manipulation isn't excellence at all. It's fraud." Sophia joined him, addressing the assembly. "We're not trying to lower standards. We're raising them by ensuring every student has a fair chance to excel." Their words resonated through the room, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from many students and teachers. Caldwell, seeing his narrative crumbling, lashed out with increasingly desperate accusations. But his words fell flat against the poise and integrity displayed by Marcus and Sophia. Principal Anderson stepped in, her voice firm. "Mr. Caldwell, that's enough. Your actions have violated the trust of this entire community. You're suspended pending the board's final decision." As Caldwell was escorted out, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. Principal Anderson addressed the assembly, announcing a series of changes: a comprehensive review of grading practices, the implementation of bias training for all staff, and the establishment of a student-led diversity and inclusion board. In a surprise announcement, she revealed that Marcus had been awarded a prestigious scholarship to an Ivy League university, recognizing his academic excellence and leadership. Sophia was commended for her role in bringing about positive change and was appointed as the first chair of the new Student Diversity Board. The assembly concluded with a sense of cautious optimism. As students filed out, many approached Marcus and Sophia, offering congratulations and support. The school was entering a new era, one where voices once silenced were now being heard and valued. In the weeks that followed, the changes began to take effect. New curricula were introduced, celebrating diverse perspectives. The halls buzzed with open discussions about identity and inclusion. While challenges remained, there was a palpable sense that the school was moving in the right direction. Marcus and Sophia, standing in the hallway on their last day before graduation, looked at each other with a mix of pride and nostalgia. They had started a movement that would continue long after they were gone, leaving behind a legacy of courage, integrity, and positive change.